Hello and welcome to Indianomics. There are a couple of big problems facing the economy. One is, of course, the farmer distress and competing poll promises or pre-poll promises being made by various political parties. A second problem is that there is an expectation that there could be something large in terms of a farm waiver plus some tweaking of the Fasal Bima Yojana and a farm income scheme, which the ruling party, which the government may promise, and that can throw the fiscal deficit either of this year or next year out of whack. And then, of course, there is the uncertainty of elections itself. So the political economy faces rather serious issues. To understand what are the limits that a government going to polls can, indulge in terms of helping the farming community, what kind of promises it can make in the interim budget and the vote on account, and to understand, of course, the larger economic context, we have with us someone who has been a veteran of economic policy making in the country for maybe 3 continuous decades from the 1990s. I have with me Mr. Montek Ahluwalia, well-known economist, and of course, former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. Mr. Ahluwalia, thank you very much for joining us. Well, first up, I wanted to ask you the legal limits of vote on account and interim budget. Can anything as big as a 2 lakh crore program be announced in an interim budget?
Well, I don't know the legal position on this. You know, the tradition has been that when a government is heading into an election, the budget is essentially an interim budget, so you don't need to discuss very much questions of feasibility and so on. Now, since the election will take place later, probably the election notification will not have been issued. I don't know legally whether you can present a budget and then simply go into the election. The problem is that if you do present a budget, then that budget will have to go through very detailed examination about feasibility, is what is being promised consistent with the fiscal deficit, all that kind of stuff. I have no idea what the government intends to do on that.
But in the 2014 vote on account and interim budget, the then Finance Minister, Mr. Chidambaram, had said that he proposes certain tax tweaks, but caveated it by saying if the same government...
Well, yes, that is actually... Yeah, you know, I remember in 2009, when we were just getting out of the crisis, I had recommended then to the Finance Minister, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, that, you know, we can't go into a budget in the middle of a global crisis and not let anybody know what you're going to do. So even though the budget itself simply repeated the previous year's numbers, Mr. Mukherjee said that at the time of the regular budget, it was his intention to increase plan expenditure by a certain amount. Now, that was not part of the budget proposal, but it was kind of a declaration of intent. So I suppose governments could always do that. But, you know, to feed that into the actual budget, I mean, it means one of 2 things. If you're going to increase expenditure on certain things, are you going to reduce it on something else? Is the budget deficit going to increase? Or are you going to cover it through new revenues? And how credible are each of these things? This will become an issue for debate and discussion.
Okay. Mr. Ahluwalia, in that case, now the other thing that is doing the rounds, and you know, pre-budget and pre-poll is a free period for speculation. The other speculation is that the income tax limit will be brought up to 5 lakh rupees. Can that be introduced in the budget? Now, let's remember, on February 1st, the government has full majority. And it can even after the recess do a full discussion and pass the budget by March 29th like it did last year. So can it introduce a tax measure like this?
Well, again, you know, legally and in terms of parliamentary tradition, I can't pronounce on that. It's one thing to say I'm going to do it. It's quite another to put it in the budget. Because if you put it in the budget, then you must be making some assumption about what's it going to do to tax revenue. So this is really, you're asking me to speculate on what the government will do. And although this is a free season for speculation, I don't think I want to add to that speculation. This is really something I don't know about.
Okay. No, I was only asking, given that you have seen many pre-election budgets, is it possible for a government to announce such a major tax reform or a tax tweak?
When you say a tax tweak, you mean you're going to actually put it in the finance bill as an amendment, or
Yes.
simply announce that we are going to do it?
No, I meant put it in the finance bill
Yes,
as
to
an
what?
announcement and get it passed.
Okay. Well, I think that will have to be judged in terms of legal feasibility and parliamentary appropriateness, and I'm just not competent to pronounce on that.
Okay.
But if it's legally possible, sure, a government can always announce what it intends to do, and then bear the consequences that how you're going to fill the hole that is created.
No, it's quite possible that a slightly different government comes in, maybe an NDA-led coalition, or maybe it's not an NDA coalition at all. So you're kind of leaving a fait accompli for the next government, isn't it?
Not really, because, if the passing of the budget is delayed, it is messy. You are constraining the next government. That is certainly true.
Okay.
And that's why most people thought that you wouldn't do that.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you, can the government do anything with this year's budget itself? Can it, for instance, on Republic Day or sometime earlier also, announce a major farm program in expectation that maybe it will be able to get the Reserve Bank's capital, at least some part of it, because the Jalan Committee will announce its decision, its conclusions before March 31st. So can it go ahead and say that we will put in, 2,000 rupees in every BPL family's Jan Dhan account or in the account of every marginal farmer? Can such a plan be announced for the current year?
Well, nothing stops the government from announcing something during the current year. If it's to be given reality, then you have to pass the relevant supplementary demand for whatever would be due in that year. But, in all probability, whatever you announce now, it would be an announcement. It's very unlikely that the procedures needed in order to get the money flowing can actually be completed within the fiscal year. Okay. So announcement is one thing, making provision is another thing.
Okay. Well, let me now come to, let me ask you to wear your economist hat and tell us your comment on the various measures and promises already being made. Farm loan waiver, sir, is this a good way to go? Repeated farm loan waivers actually affect the credit culture and bankers worry a lot.
Well, I share that view that it's not an ideal thing to do. It has been done before, and it's usually resorted to as if you like, an emergency measure of emergency relief. One difference between a farm loan waiver and some of the other programs is that a farm loan waiver is a one-off thing, whereas all the other programs that are being talked about will involve continuing expenditure. So depending on the circumstances, depending on who's covered, it's one thing to have a farm loan waiver for small farmers. It's another thing to have a farm loan waiver in states that have been agriculturally affected. It's quite another to have a universal farm loan waiver of all farm debt. And anyway, it's never all farm debt, because all you can do is waive the debt of the banks. And we know that, only the top 30% or so of farmers are getting bank loans. So I think all these things have to be weighed together. The really important thing is, if you look at it from a purely economist point of view, there is clear farm distress, in the sense that performance in the agricultural sector is not what it should have been. And the nature of the problem is also different. It's not simply a production problem. It's really a problem that we haven't given the Indian farmer the kind of marketing support that he needs. And this marketing support, in my view, cannot be done through minimum support prices. That is the strategy of yesteryear when you're looking at grain. As farmers diversify and start producing all kinds of other crops which are perishables, that's where you're getting the big differences, because farmers are getting a pittance compared to what's being given in the market. Now, you need much deeper institutional reform of markets, including legal changes, which have been talked about before. I mean, you will never get substantial corporate investment going into the whole business of logistics and trade as long as the Essential Commodities Act remains on the statute.
Okay.
Now, are we willing to abolish it? I mean, I'm in favor of repealing the Essential Commodities Act. It does not play any useful purpose. Similarly, all states have very restrictive laws regarding the agricultural produce marketing committees.
Yes.
Which, restrict trading in the APMC to licensed traders. Now, we need comprehensive reform of all of this so we can bring in private money into this whole area, and every government of the last three has talked about it. I mean, if you look at the economic surveys and the plan documents for the several years, but we're not seeing comparable action. So I feel that that's where we need to focus on. Also, by the way, providing farmers with good seeds, research-based agriculture, things of that sort.
Okay. Well, Mr. Ahluwalia, I will have to take a break, but I want to, get your views on the fact that a party that you were long associated with has also been, rooting for farm loan waivers, both in the states and even nationally. I wanted to know what you would advise them if they asked you what they should put in the manifesto. But that question, I've been speaking with Montek Ahluwalia, economist and policymaker with the UPA government for almost 3 continuous decades from 1990 onwards. Mr. Ahluwalia, I wanted to ask you about the kind of poll promises being made by the Congress party, a party that you've been earlier associated with. Loan waivers in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, and now a demand for a national waiver as well. Is this well advised?
Well, as I said earlier, at times of distress, loan waivers have been done before, and yes, in the states that has been announced. What will happen in future, I don't want to speculate on, because frankly, as we head into an election, there'll be a large number of promises made by everybody. And I'm not sure what the role of economists is in moderating those promises.
Okay.
I subscribe to the general view that while you cannot rule out a loan waiver at times of distress, there are many, many other things that need to be done to address the causes of that distress in the farm sector, and those things are actually more important. And I have no idea what will ultimately be promised as we head to the election. Let's wait and see. But I don't want to speculate on that.
Okay. Well, if you were asked for advice, what would your advice be in terms of clauses in the Congress or the UPA manifesto? Would you go by the universal basic income that a lot of people are talking about?
Well, I don't want to speculate about, since I'm not being asked for that advice.
Okay.
But I think let me say something on universal basic income. I think one of the problems is that everybody knows that we need to do something for the excluded population. And different people come up with different suggestions. And I mean, one possibility is that in a manifesto, all these suggestions will be put together. But take, for example, universal basic income. Do we really mean universal? I mean, the origin of the term universal basic income was that it's very difficult to target. Therefore, the income should be available to everybody. Now, frankly, if you provide any kind of reasonable basic income to everybody, you will need about 10% of GDP.
Yeah.
So that's just foolish. So immediately people say, oh, I didn't really mean universal, I mean targeted for the poor. That, in my view, is not a bad idea at all. But, if you do that, then some other people say that's meant to be in substitution for the existing ineffective subsidies. I think that's a very good idea too. But I've never heard somebody get up and say, I am going to abolish this subsidy and convert it into a universal income. I mean, I was in favor, for example, of moving away from the system where you provide subsidized food grain at low prices, which has all kind of leakage problems, to a designated target group, towards a system where the same designated target group gets a cash transfer. I would be strongly in favor of that. Okay. By the way, there'll be huge opposition to that. I mean, there are many well-meaning people, many NGOs, for example, who are totally opposed to a cash transfer. They prefer the subsidized food grain. They will give you many leakages in a cash transfer, but the same leakages and maybe more exist in the present system. Yes. So I think let's face it, elections are not the time to sharpen and devise sophisticated policies. Okay. They point in a broad direction. Okay. And you have to accept that and then sort of move on.
No, the only problem with accepting that is the rate at which promises are being made. One worries for the fisc. And this time the worry is not just with the central government fisc, but also the state government fisc.
Oh, I think, by the way, that is one of the biggest problems at the moment because, there's a lot of concern right now. And we keep hearing, and I hope that turns out to be true, that the central government is not going to exceed the fiscal deficit. But what a lot of people are also saying, quite rightly, is that the excess is taking place at the state government level and it's also taking place through off-budget accounting. And if you pool all of this together, the combined fiscal deficit of the country is about over 8%. I mean, that's what most people say. That's a very, very high fiscal deficit. So actually, I don't mind any promises being made as long as the party also indicates what it intends to do with the fiscal deficit. Okay. And maybe they will, I have no idea. Because, from a macroeconomic point of view, the statement that I'm going to keep the fiscal deficit at a certain level is an important statement. Okay. And within that, you can push for A or B and leave it to the government of the day to decide what gets pushed out. But you're right. Controlling the fiscal deficit is probably the most important thing to communicate, especially in a world where uncertainty is increasing. We keep discussing India as if we are a separate planet. I mean, we're part of the world. And it's a world where growth is slowing down, trade has slowed down, and thanks to all these trade war threats, there's high uncertainty. There's a possibility of interest rates being raised in the United States. The only good thing about the international situation is that oil prices will be around $60 a barrel, which is a big advantage for India. Yes. Now, faced with that situation, we have to ask, what should our policy be? And in my view, when you have a global uncertainty, that's the time to show steadiness and solidity. Because people looking around everywhere are finding uncertainties. I mean, Europe is in a mess, China is slowing down, the US has uncertainty, you've got new governments in Latin America which are speaking their own language. Now, if India can come out as a sort of rock of solid, good policy, the country has a huge amount to gain. Okay. Well, how that will happen is up to whoever's running the government.
Okay. Well, the argument would be that that's better done by a government with a stable majority. Would you agree? An alternative to this, a coalition alternative, may not be able to provide that, island of stability.
I don't buy that argument because, look, the best reforms we had were in 1991, and that was a coalition government. Since then, we've had coalition governments. The Vajpayee government was a coalition government. The UPA was a coalition government. And this is the period when India moved from being regarded as a poor performer to being regarded as a strong performer. So the proposition that coalition governments will not and cannot deliver good results is simply not true. Okay. What is important is that whatever government we have, it should have a clear sense of what the policies are that is going to follow. And I think that's what we need to focus on, not whether it's a coalition or not a coalition.
Okay. Given the number of parties in the fray, and you know them all, the kind of combinations that are coming in Uttar Pradesh and the regional parties elsewhere, and the Congress as well, a new resurgent Congress, do you think a common minimum program is possible at all?
Oh, I certainly think it should be possible. I hope it's possible. Look, all coalitions have, one way or the other, worked out a common minimum program. And, you know, in a way, I think we've got to the stage where manifestos will say a large number of things. If you have a coalition government, that's when the common minimum program gets down to a lot of hard work. And from the common minimum program, whatever, I mean, the BJP had a national common agenda or something, and the UPA, of course, had the national common minimum program. From that program will come a lot of specific things. And most people would look at those and see, are they well designed? Are they consistent with macro stability? Are they pro-investor? Are they pro-business? I mean, look, frankly, employment is the biggest problem right now. And I mean, you can only find a suitable solution to employment if you can ensure rapid growth, and also a rapid growth which is labor absorbing. One can look at sort of, there's a slogan which is like, we're going to promote employment. But what people want to know is, so what are the 6 or 7 things that you're going to do that will achieve that? And that's what people will look at. But I don't expect that to come out of manifestos. I expect that to come out after the election.
Oh, yes. A final question then, sir. A 5-year term of the NDA comes to an end. What would your analysis of that, of this era be, of these 5 years be? There are positives like MPC and the bankruptcy code and the GST. And there are those who would say that for a government that has had 4 years, 4 out of its 5 years with crude at 60 and such a big majority, not much has been achieved. Which camp are you in?
I like this, putting people in camps. Now, look, I think as far as the growth rate of the economy is concerned, it basically seems to be continuing on the growth rate that existed in the past. I also feel that many of the good things that have been done are actually a continuation of what was planned earlier. I mean, for example, the GST. I do believe that the GST is an extremely important indirect tax reform. I don't think it's been well implemented. We have far too many glitches, changes of numbers, and it's still not sorted out. But at least it's moved in the proper direction. I mean, the UPA had announced the intention to have a GST way back, I think, in 2006 or 7. And the Constitution Amendment Bill was introduced by Pranab Mukherjee in 2011. So actually, that part of it is actually a continuation. I think there are many other areas where, you know, I feel we've not made as much progress as we should have. The biggest problem is fixing the banks. I mean, we've known this from 2014 onwards. We still haven't got a credible answer. How are we going to reform the banks? How are we going to recapitalize the public sector banks? I mean, it's too late this year to get anything done. But, you know, I would have thought that given that this was known to be a major problem, we should have been further ahead in sorting this out. I mean, you know, you can go through the record bit by bit if you like.
Yes, sir. Well, actually, we are out of time. But at some other point in time, I would definitely want to debate with you on to what extent the UPA should bear the blame for what's happening in the banks, not the least nationalizing them, which perhaps is part of the problem now rather than part of the solution.
No. I mean, that's a complete... I don't agree. You better come back to that because I think that's an extremely incorrect assessment.
Fair point, sir. Fair point. We should debate on it on another day. Not the least because even the NDA has not denationalized the banks. So clearly there's a political consensus and you have a point of view. But we are out of time today. Thank you very much for your analysis of what the government can do in the vote on account and the interim budget, and your analysis of what is the prescription needed going forward. Thank you.